Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks to the folks who are here and to the folks who are watching online. And thanks to the State Department and the U.S. Center for providing the venue for this event on climate services, international collaboration, and data and science innovation in this domain. It's often said that climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. That is, can be elaborated upon by noting that when we talk about weather services, we're mostly talking about short-term forecasts of what to expect and related impacts associated with those. When we're talking about climate services, we're talking about medium-term and longer-term forecasts, and not just forecasts of what is likely to happen, what is expected to happen, what could conceivably happen, but also the implications of those possibilities for a wide variety of phenomena that impact human well-being, human economies, public health, ecosystems, and so on. Droughts, floods, wildfires, sea level rise, and much more. Clearly, as the climate continues to change, communities across the globe are moving in some sense into the unfamiliar. Things are changing in ways that are producing conditions that have not been experienced, in some cases for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, or even longer. And it is essential in that situation that communities, planners, mayors, businesses, farmers, fishermen have an improved understanding of what is coming and what it will mean for their operations, for their businesses, for the infrastructure over which they preside. Among the most vulnerable to the changes that are underway are populations in the least developed countries, least developed regions of the world, places where people's livelihoods depend even more directly and intimately on the environment than is typically the case in the industrialized nations. People along the coasts, of course, who are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding. But it's important to understand that no nation and no community is immune to the range of risks that are coming our way with climate change. Some years ago, I co-led a study for the UN Secretary General, sponsored by the United Nations Foundation, that was on responses to the climate change challenge. The subtitle of that study was Avoiding the Unmanageable and Managing the Unavoidable. And I think it was the first international study, there were 18 authors from 11 countries, first international study that actually gave equal attention to mitigation, avoiding the unmanageable, and to adaptation, managing the unavoidable. And as we have continued to contemplate the challenges of adaptation, within which category we include preparedness and resilience against impacts that do occur, we have learned a lot about how important the whole domain of climate data and climate services is and is going to be. There are at least three dimensions to this domain. One is research to understand what's coming and to understand the implications of what's coming in climate for all these variables that are linked to climate. Secondly, building the information systems that contain and can be accessed to convey that knowledge. And third, engaging the affected communities so that they will develop their capacity for managing those unavoidable impacts of climate change. That service to communities around the globe has to be understood as a global public good. In economics, public goods are defined as goods and services that are non-rival and non-excludable. That means that their consumption by one person does not diminish the ability of others to consume them. That's the non-rival part. And they are non-excludable, meaning nobody can be excluded from the benefits. The effective provision of climate services as a global public good will require international collaboration as well as innovation in science and data and the capacity and coordination that is needed to work across regions, countries, communities, and sectors to take advantage of the advances in knowledge that are coming along. In 2009, at the World Meteorological Organization's World Climate Conference 3, which took place in Geneva, delegates representing 155 nations called for a global framework for climate services, quote, to strengthen the production, availability, delivery, and application of science-based climate prediction and services. That global framework, which has been created, has played a pivotal role in fostering collaboration and mobilizing the international community to establish a global system for providing climate services. A lot of progress has been made on that front, but a lot more work is needed on the shaping and the implementation of the full array of climate services that is needed. The Obama administration has prioritized innovation in data, science, and international collaboration for climate services as one of its priorities under the Climate Action Plan that President Obama rolled out in June of 2013. In 2012, we actually had already launched the Climate Data Initiative to expand access to relevant government data and to build partnerships with the private sector to create incentives for innovation in data-driven planning and resilience tools for local communities. In 2013, we began with Canada and Mexico the North American Climate Services Partnership, NACSP, to facilitate the exchange of information, technology, and best practices related to the development of climate information and the delivery of integrated climate services for North America. Earlier this year, we initiated the Climate Services for Resilient Development Public-Private Partnership in support of a similar vision globally. That brought together the weather services and climate services of both the UK and the United States, technical companies like Esri and Google, multilateral development banks, government development agencies, the philanthropic sector, brought all those together with country leaders, with partners in developing countries to help build demand-driven climate services in vulnerable communities. The initial countries of focus for this effort are Bangladesh, Colombia, and Ethiopia. And we're working closely in that operation with all of the partners to develop the climate information systems that are needed in those countries and ultimately for propagation more widely around the world. None of the panelists today is purely in the business of climate services. Everybody up here does a wide variety of things related to environmental observations, monitoring, climate change, science, technology, and policy, but everybody here has a special angle on the climate services issue that I certainly am eager to hear about. Everybody here is involved with one or another critical aspects of creating the enabling environment for providing climate services as a public good. So let me turn to the panelists in turn, first calling on Barb Ryan, who leads the efforts of 100 member governments and 92 partner organizations to integrate Earth observations globally for informed decision-making, something obviously critical to the provision of climate services as a global public good. Barb.
Great. Thank you very much. So listen, we're happy to be here on behalf of the Group on Earth Observations, and we do have 100 members right now, so it's an intergovernmental organization. Kenya has just joined, but I think what's important is it speaks to maybe an entire ecosystem that has to come together if you do in fact want to deliver climate services globally. So we also have another category called participating organizations. There are more than 90 now, And it's the UN conventions, and so the UNFCCC is in fact a participating organization. There are UN organizations, WMO, the leader on the Global Framework for Climate Services, and then there are scientific associations. But I think that's only still part of the ecosystem. John talked about the role of the private sector. So if you are in fact going to influence decisions, then each of these partners have to come together. And so with an organization like GEO, an international organization who has really a very simple mandate, we just want to make sure that Earth observations, and that's any Earth observations in, on, or around the Earth, inform decision making. And you do that a couple different ways. One, you've got to advocate for the continuation of these observing systems. We've got to advocate for broad open data policies, and for us that feeds really into this public good concept, because without broad open data policies, at least for the information that our governments collect, we are not going to bring global transparency to this entire issue. So global transparency is really important, but I think what's so important, and this ties in particularly well to the private sector, is open data, particularly on the government side, is actually an economic engine as well. And so you want small and medium-sized enterprises coming in and adding value to the Earth observation data that largely governments are collecting, not exclusively, but largely governments are collecting right now. And so they've got to be in the room if you're going to complete this value chain. So open data for transparency, for an economic stimulus. And then I think what's really important is that whether you look at the NOAA globe or you look at the NASA Hyperwall, if you've been here over the last couple weeks, what's really clear is that the Earth operates as a system. It doesn't operate with just the atmospheric domain or the terrestrial domain or the oceanic domain. And I think one of the issues that we have actually in all of our organizations, particularly in all of our governments, many of our institutions are still structured domain by domain. And so it's not going to, we're not going to be able to model the true interaction of the Earth system unless we can somehow meaningfully pull these institutions together. And so let's just bring it maybe full circle back to the climate service argument. The very reason GEO was created the early discussions occurred in 2002 after the first World Summit on Sustainable Development, because it was clear back then that there are certain domains, and the weather domain was particularly called out, where we've got great examples of international collaboration, but it's a very integrated system. We have national weather services around the world. We have a UN organization or an international organization that governs many of those policies, and we broadly share data, at least some data, on the precipitation and temperature and pressure side of the house. How come we don't have those same end-to-end services in all the other domains that exist? So agriculture, biodiversity, ecosystems, climate, and water, and energy. And so the genesis for GEO was to bring to these other domains that same kind of integration and impetus that we have in fact seen on the weather side. And so I think there's a wonderful model there as we start to move down this climate journey, but it's much broader. If we are in fact going to deliver meaningful climate services, then it is not just the atmospheric domain. We need to bring in oceans, we need to bring in the atmosphere, and we need to bring in the terrestrial components, and the terrestrial components are just extensive. And I guess maybe the last thing that I would say is it's not just space-based observations, while they are phenomenal, and then can provide the interstices where we do not have in situ observations. But for the foreseeable future, we are still going to need in situ or ground-based, surface-based, or atmospheric observations from sensors in place so that we can tie values into those observations that we see from space. And so I think I'll stop there and then
Good.
come back.
All right, well, thank you, Barb. And we will hear next from Robert Kirkpatrick, who also leads an international collaboration around data that supports climate services, but with a different angle. Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. So I'm going to talk about climate services, but let me provide a bit of background first in why I think perhaps the definition of climate services needs to be broadened slightly. At Global Pulse, we run a network of data science innovation labs in New York, Uganda, and Indonesia, where we partner with private sector, academia, UN agencies, national institutions to develop solutions that use real-time big data, particularly on human behavior, to develop solutions to address challenges all across the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as humanitarian action and climate resilience. So if you think about the world we live in today, people are producing this vast amount of information. We hear about this stuff, big data, all the time, right? People searching online, communicating through mobile phones, sharing their lives through social networks, buying and selling goods, transferring money, moving about cities in ways that create traces. What's interesting is that when people's needs change, they change how they use these services. They change what they search for. They change how they communicate, how they move, how they spend, what they choose to buy. They change how they talk about their lives, their perceptions of events, their perceptions of products, their perceptions of alternatives in where their life could go. And it turns out that this information is incredibly relevant for development because it lets you see things that were invisible to us before. So a few examples. We found there's a 0.89 correlation between how people spend money on their phones in countries in East Africa and how they spend money on food at the household level for market-dependent households. So it turns out basically we can predict and detect increases in food insecurity all across Africa simply by looking at changing patterns of how people bought tens of millions of scratch card top-offs on their phones. Every mobile phone operator in Africa is running a food security monitoring network without knowing it. In Indonesia, we've developed an algorithm that predicts food prices from social media. People complain a lot in the markets, and we can actually see what people are choosing to pay, or not pay, and how much financial stress that's creating. You can see how people are displaced by events like floods. We've got a lot of work recently in Indonesia on the haze that's being created by fires in Sumatra and how it's affecting people's lives. You can model the spread of diseases that are related to climate change, such as malaria and dengue, by looking at how people move through mobile phone networks. As they make calls through different towers, you can actually see the population movement in real time. So why am I telling you this? What does it have to do with climate services? Essentially, we're moving into a world in which it will be possible to do the socioeconomic equivalent of meteorology, right? Today, I can go to 100 websites, I can log on, I can type in my postal code, and I can get real-time information on temperature, airspeed, cloud cover, barometric pressure. Soon, it will be possible one day, 10 years, to log on and see what's happening in terms of food security, poverty, agricultural production, gender equality, you name it. Now, this matters a great deal for climate because I think, the last couple of decades there's been a great deal of emphasis on collecting information about the climate and about the context of human activity to build an evidence base that would persuade people to take action. But when we actually talk about catalyzing action, climate services will get people to understand the climate is changing, but what is going to tell us that we are changing? Because if you talk about mitigation, that means changing ourselves. If you talk about adaptation, that means changing ourselves. It's changing our behavior and our systems. We see in real-time analysis of big data the opportunity to create the feedback loops that could, for example, tell you by analyzing billions of e-commerce transactions where in the world people are transitioning to more sustainable forms of lighting, right? Where they are purchasing parts to maintain old, inefficient, high emissions machines versus upgrading to more modern equipment. what their perceptions are of the effectiveness of policies, how resilient they are to the effects of climate change. That's not about measuring climate, that's about measuring us. This information can't be open data in its raw form. That's a big difference with big data. We think of big data as a kind of new natural resource. It's an ocean of it around us, but it's sort of fallen prey to an extractive industry. It's in the hands of an opaque, number of companies who use the data in ways that not everybody understands and feels comfortable with. The benefits aren't reaching the poorest and most vulnerable, and the skills needed to extract social value are in the hands of the few. This new natural resource also has some similarities to, let's say, less to solar or wind and more to uranium. As we've all learned the hard way, its nature is to leak and contaminate, and in the wrong hands, it can cause harm. So when we talk about the data ecosystem needed to bring together all of these different data types that reveal facets of human behavior relevant to mitigation and adaptation, it's going to take new kinds of public-private partnerships. It's going to take new regulatory frameworks that can help protect privacy while still delivering new valuable insights and help us understand the relationship between the risk of using the data and the risk of not using the data. I think we need a new approach to privacy here as well. So this is an area where we think, as we think about climate services, just like you think about your advertising as a company, but how are you going to know whether the advertising is working? How are we going to know whether our efforts and our climate services are actually affecting change? Because the signal can't be the temperature rise 10 years later. We need to know day by day, week by week, month by month, whether people are responding and changing what they do.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Let me now turn it over to Sir David King, who, among many other distinctions, has a long history of working with international partners on a wide variety of issues related to climate change. David.
What I would like to do is take you back into the year 2001, and this is a piece of personal history. I was Chief Scientific Advisor to the British government, and I began a foresight program in that year looking at the impacts of climate change on the British Isles. And I'm describing it as the British Isles rather than the United Kingdom because we're an island nation surrounded by water. And of course, the real concern I had was that rising sea levels and changing storm patterns would impact on the British Isles severely going forward in time. So how did we do this? And I'm putting this story to you because this is a very early example of climate services. We went to our Met Office, Hadley Center, who had an extraordinarily strong model, even at that time, to model the physics of the climate of the planet. And we simply got them to tell us what the impacts would be over the coming 80 years for the British Isles from climate change and changing weather patterns and rising sea levels. And of course, the biggest impacts that arose from this for the British Isles was from flooding, because when we have storms at sea, we also have storms inland, and these are fluvial floods, floods down the rivers, at the same time as we get attacks from the coastline. And the result of this, which took 3 years, 120 people working on it for me, most of them from outside government, experts brought in from other countries as well. We brought in experts as we went along who could advise government on how to manage the risk downwards, which goes back to something where John started. And in bringing in those experts, we realized we had to bring in floodwater managers, people who know how to manage floodwater, engineers who know how to build structures to defend coastlines and so on. And we began spending £250 million a year as a result of that program. I reported it to Parliament in 2003. And more importantly, if you like, the government took two decisions. One, that we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, because the worst scenario going forward in time, the business as usual, was one that a response becomes one of ordered retreat from various bits of our coastline rather than being able to defend them. And living in a nation that was getting smaller, was not very attractive to anybody, but particularly to the members of parliament whose constituencies were down as going underwater as we moved on in time. Business as usual was therefore unacceptable. That was the first conclusion. We have to persuade the world to go down this 2-degree centigrade route. The second thing we did was spend this £250 million on floodwater management. And we declared floodplains. The floodwater has to go somewhere. And those floodplains, we put building restrictions into those floodplains. Now, I'm telling you all of this because we had the worst flood in our history in 2013-14, the winter 2013-14. The overall cost of the flood damage was of the order of £500 million. Without this program of floodwater management, and the program meant every one of our major assets was saved from the floods, the damage would have been measured in hundreds of billions of pounds. So this was just a demonstration, I think, of the importance of climate services. What we need is to deliver for every nation the capability that we applied on the British Isles in that period leading up to that big flood in 2012. Needless to say, we're also spending further money now as we go forward in time. Now, my second point is, as a result of this, we developed a climate development and knowledge network facility out of our Department for International Development, and we take that to country by country around the world. So this matches what the Americans are doing. And so I was actually involved in the first rollout of that. We took it to Rwanda. The government of Rwanda now has a green growth and climate resilience policy embedded in every ministry of government. The starting point of that was to bring in our Met Office again, to gather all of the Met records that we could get our hands on from the country, to model on a small pixel scale, using our big Met Office model, what the impacts of climate change would be for that country, and then to put in place climate resilience measures. These are still going on. Now, I have to say, this kind of process gets stronger as the UK and the United States work together. We are working with different models at NOAA and the Met Office, both models extraordinarily good, and we can compare how these models predict behavior for different countries. So the starting point of what I'm saying is every country was acclimatized to its climate that no longer applies to any country. We're all faced with change. And my final point, if I could add one, is extreme weather events are still the most dramatic and damaging of all events. And being able to predict these events with as long an advance as possible is critical. So when Hurricane Haiyan hit the Philippines, our Met Office gave a 12-day warning to the Philippines government. And the point of impact of the hurricane with the Philippines and the timing of the impact was amazingly accurate, as well as the strength of the hurricane. The planet has not on record seen such a strong hurricane before, but we still predicted the intensity of that hurricane. That ability ought to manage the loss of lives from these extreme weather events. And it's all done with the same model that predicts tomorrow's weather, extreme weather events with 12 days notice, and the long-term climate change.
Well, thank you, all of you. I'm going to, before we throw it open to the audience for questions, I'm going to ask one question of my own for each of you and go in the same order. I wonder if you could tell us, from your own standpoint, what you think the most important constraint is that is currently impeding our ability to provide adequate climate services around the world, and what you would do if you were king. Well, he is king, but what you would do if you were king or queen to address that constraint. Please, Barb.
This will be no surprise for you, I don't imagine, because from our perspective, it is absolutely broad open data policies. We still, while there are advances that have been made globally, and some countries have done a better job than others, there are still many parts of the world and many institutions, and I would say almost every government of the world, that still are not sharing their data for a whole host of reasons. My neighboring country might use it against me. I'm a scientist, and I don't want to get beat to publishing these results, so I'm not going to release the data, even though it was purchased and paid for at government expense. And so there are still many, many reasons, but that is, governments are still, government agencies are still selling data, even though there is very solid statistics that can show the economic analysis for the return to the government far exceeds the amount of money that's coming in for selling that data. Now, we wouldn't argue that government agency X doesn't need some money to get that data out the door, but it's a much stronger argument if the money that that government agency needs to get out the door is just added to their budget and they give the data away. The government will benefit from that decision. So broad open data policies, without a doubt.
Thank you. Robert.
So the type of data that we're interested in bringing in is the data that the private sector has versus public sector institutions. And there, I'd say there are a pair of constraints that compete for first place, and they're intimately related. Let's pick one industry as a guinea pig, the mobile industry. How people spend money on phones predicts how much food they have. Where they make calls can show you how they move. Increasingly, cell towers have solar panels that actually record every 5 or 6 seconds the solar energy striking that panel. That can be used, for example, to estimate the amount of energy that's reaching nearby crops. The microwave links between the towers are degraded by precipitation. So we see an opportunity there essentially to use these mobile networks as meteorological stations, for example, to detect flash floods when you have a serious drop in the decibel strength of the connection between the towers. Companies are sitting on this data, and they're actually deleting this stuff every half an hour, for much of it, because it doesn't have any business value. Some of the data, like the data that you produce by when you make calls and how you move, is incredibly sensitive. So what we have is companies could share this data, but one, they see a lot of risk of doing it because people aren't aware of the public good benefits of the data and how it could contribute to climate resilience. You don't have those examples, and so what people dwell on are the privacy issues. We need privacy protection frameworks for these kinds of data sets that are based on solid scientific evidence, both of the re-identification risk in these data sets and also the utility operationally for making different kinds of decisions. And secondly, the business cases. Right? I think one of the challenges is we're imagining a world in which 10 years from now, companies are running public good-oriented business analytics inside their networks and producing information that will be useful to policymakers and communities at every level to understand how collective efforts on addressing climate change are going. And I think the challenge there is going to be how is the company going to monetize that infrastructure? We envision, for example, if you see people spending a lot less very quickly on their phones, that's of humanitarian concern. But if you see a slight decrease, perhaps that could be used to target sales of insurance to farmers. So figuring out where there's a hybrid business model that will create the incentives for sharing data is going to be critical, because you can't simply mandate that companies open the data. You could force them from a regulatory standpoint to share the insights, but regulation's a terrible strategy for innovation, and we want companies around the world competing to build the best solutions for climate action by reusing their data.
Good. David.
I'm going to be very brief, and you'll probably be pleased about that. I think the most important thing is the capacity the UK government has developed in working overseas. we have committed 0.7% of our GDP each year to an aid program, or to aid programs. And that amounts to about $18 billion a year. I would like to see every country raise their aid program to 1% per annum so that we can actually get on and deliver these projects properly to every region of the world. And I mean every region, because in large countries, different regions have very different impacts from climate change. So we have the capability, we know we can do the modeling, we know it's expensive, we know we could roll it out if we had the resources.
Okay, let's see what questions we have from the audience. And we have a microphone which can migrate. So if you have a question, let me note that a question is no more than 2 sentences, the second of which ends in a question mark, and invite interventions that meet that model from the audience.
And I will also ask for anyone watching online, you can get your questions in using the hashtag AskUSCenter. Any questions out there?
Sorry, I came late, but my name is Rama Sofia Rajdi for United States Press Agency. I'm based here in Paris as a correspondent. Thank you for let us, being attending the scientist side, because so far it's been very few. How far is the scientific community involved into the negotiations that are going on at the moment? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure that that's so much a question about climate service, but I will try to answer it anyway. I think that the scientific community has provided the fundamental insights that are informing the negotiation. And those insights are that the climate of the globe is changing in a pace and in a pattern that is not explained by natural influences, but is explained by the influence of the greenhouse gases and the black carbon that humans have added to the atmosphere. That harm is already occurring around the world in many different forms, from those changes in climate, torrential downpours, more flooding, more drought, more wildfires, more heat waves, more of the most powerful storms, and that in consequence of those insights and the further insight that we know the momentum in the climate system and the inertia in the world's energy system mean that there will be further change before we can bring it to a halt, it becomes essential that we act now, that we act quickly, forcefully, and adequately to address this question. Those scientific underpinnings of the negotiations are key. And I think the prospect of progress and the prospect of a satisfactory agreement from this COP-21 really rests on the fact that the leaders of the world in a very large majority have understood that message from the science community, and they are committed, I think, to acting not because one group is urging on the other that action is required, but rather because everybody recognizes that this is a problem that can only be solved if everyone participates. That's true on the mitigation side, it's true on the adaptation side, and it is one that compels action by everybody at this juncture, because the costs of dealing with it will be far, far smaller than the costs that will emerge if we don't. I think at this stage of the negotiations, there's not a lot of further scientific input because it's not needed. I think the negotiators all understand the scientific fundamentals.
Do we have any questions? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, never mind. Go ahead.
I'd just like to join in, because I think the question is very relevant to what we're talking about. We can manage with climate services. We can reduce damage, provided, and I go back to the point I made about the British Isles, provided globally we do rapidly reduce emissions. The scientific message has got across, but let me just say, it's got across extraordinarily slowly, that we have to stay below 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise. That is getting more and more challenging as time goes by. We should also agree with the small island states saying we should stay below a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, the problem is that we have difficulty in trying to achieve that now. So there is a bit of a disjuncture, I'm going to say, between the science advice and the speed of response of the global community.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, I see one.
My name is Madeleine Thompson. I'm from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University in New York, although I might not sound like it. My question is really around data policy from the national meteorological agencies. European policy has very much restricted data access historically, and many African countries follow European processes on that. The US has had a much more open data policy structure. What incentives do you think need to be created for meteorological agencies in developing countries that would give them the confidence to release their data or make their data and their information more accessible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me answer that with just a quick story from the United States. I worked most of my career in the Geological Survey, U.S. Geological Survey, and the first Landsat satellite was launched in 1972. And so for 30 plus years, the U.S. sold Landsat data. $300 or $400 a scene when the government operated the satellites, $3,000 or $4,000 a scene when the private sector operated the satellites in the mid-'80s. And so the Geological Survey was my organization at the time. We were bringing in $4.5 or $5 million to sell that data. So I would argue that almost no argument is going to get the agencies themselves to get out of a changed data policy. It has to be elevated to a much higher level. And so what happened in the United States is, after many years of fighting, half of this gray hair is from that issue, it was finally OSTP and the White House that took this issue on because they looked at who was buying the data. Number one, other federal agencies. Number two, universities getting their money from the National Science Foundation. And number three, contractors getting their money from the Defense Department. So while one agency was benefiting, it was largely public money and we were incurring transaction costs. And so the fight inside the Geological Survey was as tough as outside because there was no incentive to stop changing it. So it's got to be elevated, and the most important thing now is 3 years after that was, so 53 scenes a day of Landsat data was sold from 1974 until the policy was changed in 2008. 53 scenes a day. 5,700 scenes a day to this day are being downloaded of Landsat data as soon as the policy changed. 2 orders of magnitude. Canada's seen similar experience when they just opened it up to other federal agencies, a 1 order of magnitude increase for their RadarSat data. So the arguments have got, and then the economic analysis that was done in 2011 on the Landsat story, $2.1 billion of economic return, $1.7 billion to the United States, $400 million globally. So other governments, countries, economies of the world benefited from that policy change in the United States, and that $2.1 billion far exceeds the $4.5 million that one federal agency was taking in. And I think there are a lot of, particularly on the Met side or the Geological Survey side, a lot of agencies are selling data nowhere near $4.5 or $5 million. They might be taking in $17,000 a year to sell the data. We've got to convince governments that if they do have $17,000 of costs, give them the $17,000. You will be helping other federal agencies to use that meteorological data or that hydrological data or that geological data, and that's essential. So it's got to be higher up than the agency that's benefiting from the revenue stream.
Okay, other questions from the audience?
Well, I have one, if that's okay. We've talked a lot about constraints of gathering data and gathering big data, but let's flip that on its head a little bit. What about the constraints on the user side of actually using that data properly with the education of knowing what to do with all of that data?
Well, let me start. I think there'll probably be some other comments on this as well. That is really the difference between initiatives like the U.S. Climate Data Initiative, just putting the data out there, and the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is aimed at making data available in packages, in formats, with visualization options, with graphical options, with regional specificity, with sectoral specificity, in ways that makes it actionable, that makes the information accessible to the kinds of folks who need it, and that does it in forms and with the appropriate definitions, caveats, disclaimers, uncertainty bars that make it possible for decision makers of all varieties, from farmers and fishermen to homeowners to mayors to city planners, to make appropriate use of the information. And that is a big jump. There is a huge amount of work in moving from databases to really usable climate resilience tools. I suspect my colleagues on the panel might have something to add on that topic.
No, I mean, certainly in terms of the use of the data, I mean, there's a general problem with data. The more data you have available, the more opportunities there are to use it, and the more clear it becomes that a tiny fraction of the population who could benefit from using it actually has the skills to use it. Data literacy is a huge issue. When you start talking about all of these different kinds of data, that issue is amplified very quickly, because then you're really into the field of data science and how you can build models that incorporate everything from imagery to human mobility to pattern, flows of wind and temperature to the kinds of issues that people are talking about on social media and doing analysis of large collections of unstructured data. You have issues of data literacy at the community level. And in institutions, I think the principal challenge is getting them to imagine a very different way of operating, right? Because I think what's different about big data especially is that governments don't have any role in its collection. So if you think about the open data movement for the last 10 plus years, a lot of governments decide what data to collect. They decide what data gets shared and when. Often the data is shared years after it was collected and years after it's most relevant for accountability. So I think one of the interesting dimensions of these new sources of data is that they're real time and government plays no role in it. They didn't get to decide what data engineers needed to run a financial institution or a mobile network. And so I think the accountability dimensions here are profound. Because if you can show that efforts to reduce emissions, efforts to create green jobs, efforts to make populations more resilient to drought or floods are not working, that isn't going to be 3 years after the fact. That can be while the response to the flood is still going on, right? Because it's real-time information. So the challenge really is getting public sector institutions to think, if that's the reality we're moving into, what are the rules by which we operate? Because they're different.
Good. We are coming to the end of our time. We have a few minutes left. I would like to offer each of the panelists an opportunity for a minute or two of any closing thoughts you would want to offer. Starting again with Barb.
Thanks. With the microphone, I just might add one more point to that last question, and I think also from a geo perspective, that's where we really would like to see the private sector come in, because sometimes you need translators, you need other entities that can come in and do something with that data. And so I think the whole evolution of apps that can be created for mobile phones, there's just a creativity there on the private sector side but they've got to get access to the data too. So that's that. Just in closing, again, I'd just like to come back to the importance of broad open data policies as an enabler, not only for global transparency, but for economic growth within the government. And we've just got to do a better job of getting that issue out, because I don't think we'll get to the point of delivering true climate services that integrate across the atmospheric, terrestrial, and oceanic domains and really start being able to model the Earth system in any kind of meaningful way if we can't get all governments of the world with their government and agencies to release that data.
I'll follow on Barb's point to private sector. If you think your data could be useful for catalyzing global action on climate change, there are opportunities to make that happen if you go to dataforclimateaction.org. This is a challenge that we at the Secretary General's office are putting out to companies. Maybe it's data you have, maybe it's cloud computing resources you could make available to researchers, data scientists who could do training in universities and institutions in the global south to identify and design solutions to some of the climate-related issues facing these countries. There are huge opportunities to help. I think we can go a little further. I don't think we're going to be able to address this challenge without the data from the private sector playing a major role in the insights we need to make smarter decisions in the future. Thanks.
I'm just going to relate this back to what is happening here in Le Bourget, the climate negotiations. When the negotiations began, anyone who's been involved for any length of time will know no discussion of adaptation, no discussion of resilience. It's now a very big item in the negotiating halls. And what we are capable of doing with the modeling that we've been talking about, the management of enormous data sets and the prediction with tremendous physics, is the capability to provide the services that each country needs in order to make that adaptation. That's the big step forward we've made. We still have a giant step forward to take that capability to every country that needs it.
Let me just close with two very quick points. One is to underscore a point that David was making earlier and that others have made in various ways, and that is the important interaction between mitigation and adaptation. We cannot survive with a mitigation-only strategy because climate change is already underway, it's already doing damage, we can't stop it overnight. But we cannot survive with an adaptation-only strategy because adaptation gets more difficult, more expensive, and less effective the larger are the changes in climate to which we are trying to adapt. And that's why we absolutely need the emphasis on both, which has finally come to characterize the COP meetings as well as the scientific discussion. The second point I would make is about data. For 36 years as a professor at Berkeley and Harvard, I taught a course on environmental science for policymakers. And in the very first lecture in that course, I always said, the data are rarely everything, but they are always something. They always matter in some sense. And making decisions about policy, about actions, about public well-being in the absence of adequate data is always a serious mistake. That is nowhere more true than in the area we've been talking about, the necessity of data to make appropriate decisions both about mitigation and about adaptation. The climate services theme of this session has been about the kinds of data we need for adaptation, preparedness, and resilience, and there is nothing more important to that aim than making sure that we get full access to data and that we provide that information in forms that are usable, relevant, actionable, and reliable. So thanks to all the panelists for this conversation. Thanks to the audience, both in person and watching on the web.